Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Justin Logan of the Cato Institute about U.S.-China competition, the divide in the Republican Party over Ukraine, and whether ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Iran really pose a threat to America today. And then we dive into President Biden's new memo on infrastructure security, the political fallout at home and abroad from the Israel-Hamas war, and whether Elon Musk could buy TikTok. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. We have a packed show again this week and a great guest coming up to talk about fires and foreign policy issues in seemingly every corner of the world right now. But first things first, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. There are a couple things that have broken in recent days that deserve more attention. The first one for me was President Biden's issuing of a new U.S. national security memo, essentially an executive order for strategy guidance on April 30th. That lays out a new U.S. government-wide plan to protect American critical infrastructure in the face of growing cyber threats posed by China, Russia, and other U.S. adversaries. The memo focuses specifically on countering cyber threats to federal government agencies and private companies that manage mass communications equipment, i.e. telephone systems, electronic banking systems, transportation systems, water systems, dams, the electrical grid, the energy sector. The timing of this is interesting in an election year, although contrary to what some analysts might jump to, I actually don't think this has anything to do with election politics, but more it's a manifestation of really big concern across the U.S. intelligence community, the NSA, for instance, and so on, about growing signs of Chinese and Russian state-backed hacking and other cyber attack operations aimed at U.S. critical infrastructure systems, and the prospect that some kind of multifold crippling cyber attack could happen right before or right after or during the 2024 election. Remember, we've seen FBI Director Christopher Wray warn repeatedly, most recently this month, that American adversaries, namely China, intends to land low blows against civilian infrastructure to try and induce panic and break America's will to resist. As wild as that sounds, behind the scenes in Washington, this is being taken very seriously. And Biden's move was to announce this new strategy that centers on getting what are called sector risk management agencies, essentially secretive nodes peppered across the federal government departments. Think energy, homeland security, treasury, food and agriculture, health and human services, to get them more clearly monitoring and communicating about evolving cyber threats on a day-to-day basis. It's an interesting development. This is the first time in about 10 years, actually, since 2013, that a U.S. president has issued a government-wide infrastructure security memo. Another one on my radar, Ben, has to do with Elon Musk and his surprise trip to China at the end of April. A big part of the trip, remember, Musk's Tesla company has major business in China. A major part of the trip was that Tesla had gotten an agreement to launch its full self-driving, or FSD, software feature in China. That development did draw global media attention, but it caught my eye specifically because it suggests that Elon Musk is currently very much in the good graces of the government in Beijing. This matters if we go out to 50,000 feet and consider the ongoing fight over TikTok. Remember, Congress just passed and President Biden just signed a law ordering TikTok's China-based parent company ByteDance to sell TikTok or have TikTok banned in the United States. The law says either of those things must happen within 1 year. A major hurdle, however, is that the Chinese government has said it has the authority to block or approve any sale of TikTok by ByteDance, and it won't allow any sale. But could Elon Musk be approved by Beijing as a potential buyer, given that Musk already owns Twitter, which is now called X, obviously, and he clearly has influence in Beijing vis-a-vis Tesla? That's something we're going to be following over the coming weeks and months. Interestingly, Musk wrote about the TikTok developments on X in April, saying he doesn't think TikTok should be banned in the U.S. because of free speech concerns, even though such a ban may benefit his X platform. The question really is whether China's government would approve Musk as a buyer.
Elon Musk is one of our favorite characters, of course, here in the Threat Status podcast. And it's not just because he is in and of himself an interesting figure and by all accounts a fascinating human being. It's because he is now sort of embedded himself really in national security and foreign policy debates in a way that I don't think he's going to be able to be extricated from, even if he wanted to get out himself. I mean, we've talked before recently about Starlink, the internet terminals, the Starlink mobile internet terminals, and the role they played in the Russia-Ukraine war, and how Elon Musk essentially, as the head of SpaceX, controlling those terminals, is directly involved in the Russia-Ukraine war and is playing a pivotal role. It's sometimes to the benefit of Ukraine, sometimes reportedly not so much. So Musk, and especially now heading into an election year, how Musk positions himself with all of these issues sort of swirling in the background is going to be fascinating to watch, to say the least. Quickly, Guy, I want to move to Israel and Hamas hostage negotiations and ceasefire negotiations. One of my favorite subject areas, of course, is the intersection of foreign policy and domestic politics, and boy, oh boy, we sure do have that right now with the Israel-Hamas war. Let's take stock of this situation. Secretary of State Antony Blinken back in the Middle East this week. He has apparently assumed once again the mantle of chief U.S. diplomat with respect to Israel and Hamas. We've talked before in the show how CIA Director William Burns has often seemed like the de facto chief of the U.S. diplomatic team, trying to facilitate a deal between Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire that would, among other things, bring about the release of some of the remaining hostages held by Hamas and forestall an Israeli invasion of the city of Rafah, which the U.S. and other nations have warned Israel against. But now Blinken's back, and he's trying to get this across the finish line. The most recent proposal reportedly would pause the fighting in exchange for the release of about 33 hostages, and Israel, of course, would also have to release some more Palestinian prisoners. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has indicated the Rafah operation is going to go forward regardless. The Prime Minister's office told the press after Netanyahu's meeting with Blinken, quote, "The Rafah operation does not depend on anything." Prime Minister Netanyahu made this clear to Secretary Blinken in their meeting this week. He's also made clear that a permanent end to the operation in Gaza is off the table. And that's because he's sticking by the position that Hamas needs to be destroyed. That's something, by the way, that the Biden administration seemed to agree with in the days and weeks after the October 7th attack, but apparently not so much anymore. Hamas being destroyed seems to necessitate, by most accounts, the Rafah operation. Israel says a lot of Hamas fighters are there. There's also the issue of underground tunnels from the Egyptian side of the border coming in to Rafah that Israel wants to destroy. So, Guy, there's a lot of things coming to a head here at once. If the Rafah operation were to go ahead, that means without question, you're going to have more destruction and civilian deaths in Gaza. That probably means more protests across the West, including on college campuses here in the U.S. We discussed that on last week's show, and the situation has only gotten more intense since then. We had police in riot gear on the campus of Columbia just a couple of days ago. For Biden, a Rafah operation is a nightmare as far as domestic politics go. Do we think these protests would slow down if Israel launches that kind of operation? Of course not. Biden's boxed in. There's not a clear way out. The administration won't admit this publicly, of course, Guy, but I think that's part of the reason why you've got Blinken in the Middle East pushing so hard for a ceasefire deal right now. It might give the administration a temporary reprieve, maybe a chance to tell all of these protesters here domestically that, look, my administration has stopped the fighting, at least for a while. We facilitated a ceasefire deal. So there are political dynamics all over the place. We haven't even gotten into Netanyahu's domestic political concerns in Israel. All of that is sort of just being thrown into this stew right now, and how it plays out heading into the election season is anybody's guess. What I wonder, guys, would a ceasefire actually be a good thing? If Netanyahu's determined to go into Rafah no matter what, as he says, isn't a ceasefire just delaying the inevitable?
A ceasefire would definitely be a good thing, Ben, and it would also open the door possibly to the return of Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas.
And we are joined now by Justin Logan. He is the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Justin, so glad to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Let's jump right in here. There's a huge push, obviously, to counter China and to spend a lot of money doing so, to build bases in the Philippines. The Pentagon says China is the quote-unquote pacing challenge for the U.S., and that's sort of driving broader, DoD spending and broader U.S. foreign policy as a whole right now. So kind of a two-part question. How do you gauge the threat from China right now? And do you think this administration, the Biden administration, is doing a good job managing it?
Well, first of all, thanks to you guys for having me on. I didn't know this was going to be a 7-hour podcast, but I'm very happy to talk about that question here at the outset. No, I think the entire foreign policy establishment has a real hard time dealing with China, right? China's a witchy sort of problem. Everyone reaches for the Cold War metaphor to say we're in a new Cold War with China. But there are a bunch of fundamentally different attributes to the U.S.-China competition that didn't exist with the Soviet Union. Number one is that we have this deep economic engagement or entanglement or whatever you may want to call it with China that we did not by any stretch have. We had almost the opposite, autarky vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And so that is kind of a confounding factor where no administration, even the Trump administration, didn't say we want to economically contain China, right? They never said that. However, there's a simple thing happening here that is an ineluctable logic. China's economic engagement with the world is fueling China's economic growth. I don't even think that's in dispute. I don't think anybody anywhere on the political spectrum would argue with that. China's economic growth is being used in part to modernize and expand the Chinese military. And I think there was this magical thing that was supposed to happen at some point where China got rich and then either became more democratic or became, kind of like U.S. partners in Europe or somewhere where it wasn't really worried about about U.S. domination in security terms of its region. And that hasn't panned out, unfortunately. And so I think we're stuck with this kind of, if you think that China's growing power is a problem, it's a monster kind of our own creation. Because this economic engagement that we've been in favor of for the better part of 25 years is producing the monstrous behavior. And so, you hear Jake Sullivan talk about a small yard and a high fence in terms of what we're trying to cordon off from China economically, technology and whatnot. But that yard is growing over time, right? It's gone from microchips and other things, and it's getting into electric vehicles and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's an interesting intellectual problem to watch policy on China, but it's kind of frustrating because of this sort of fundamental logic that I think everybody is at great pains to duck.
Do you think the idea of a Chinese operation, an invasion of Taiwan, is that threat overblown in your view?
In some quarters, I think it is. I mean, I think the tendency to say, that we have a 2027 window and we know, it is the case that Xi Jinping says he wants the PLA and the PLAN to be ready by 2027. But that's how politicians and militaries operate, right? That's if he had a plan to do it by then, I don't think he would announce we're going to do it by then. Uncertainty is a friend to policymakers in this regard. So I think when people are saying we know this is going to happen by such and such a date, yes, I think that is overstatement. I think it's also the case that, it's a good thing, especially for Americans, that, amphibious invasions are still hard, right? We have our own memory of one that was really ugly that, thank God, went our way in the end. But they're really hard, right? And if you look at even what's transpired over the last 80 years in terms of sensors and other technology that you can use defensively, they're still really, really hard. And so, that's a good thing that we have going in our favor that, as we're relearning in Ukraine, geography that is conducive to invasion is a real problem. Flat, open territory can cause real problems. And thankfully, the Taiwan Strait is not flat land.
Is it wrong that the Biden administration has signaled that the U.S. would essentially militarily support Taiwan in the event of this very hard hypothetical amphibious invasion?
Yeah, I think it was in the best case clumsy eruption from, a president that may have been, had a long day on 3 separate occasions. So I worry about that, right? In the sense that, the White House has walked back this statement 3 times. And look, the intricacies of Henry Kissinger's diplomacy in the early 1970s is tough for people who do this for a living, right? And so trying to remember, the 3 assurances and all the rest of it, it's tough stuff. But saying flat out, we would defend Taiwan if it were attacked 3 separate times while you're getting a different message from the State Department, to me is, not great statecraft, right? And you even see in Taiwan, for example, to my mind, they should be spending 8% of GDP on defense. They face a real problem now.
I mean, the last government, the Tsai government, moved the ball forward on that. I mean, I was in Taiwan twice in the last couple of years and saw that societal change and political change.
They've gone from 4 months to 1 year in terms of the conscription schedule, but the numbers, I don't know what do defense people have to say here. Quantity has a quality all its own. Quantity does, in this case, I think, have a quality all its own. And, to my mind, yes, it's certainly true that Taiwan and also Japan have increased their defense exertions, but the 10, 20-year timelines are stacked so heavily. I'll say this, I think in some cases the Americans have been more Taiwanese than the Taiwanese, right? We have been ringing the alarm bell for, the better part of a decade. And, again, we've gotten them to 2.5% of GDP. Is that enough? Not to my mind, because there are some things that we can't do on Taiwan's behalf. If you assume, an invasion scenario, first 72, 96 hours, they're going to be going it alone. It's going to take, we don't have 30,000 Marines on Taiwan.
Given Cato's libertarian reputation, I want to go, and you mentioned Ukraine and geography. You had the Bob Kaplan, invadable steppe reference. I want to ask you about the foreign policy divide within the Republican Party. Because I think there's a very clear intellectual divide for those of us who want to appreciate it between libertarians and big-time hawks or establishment hawks or neocons. But when it comes to Ukraine aid, I mean, the recent aid package passed, but it took months. What are your thoughts on why it took so long, and was it good that it passed? And then are you concerned that some right-wing conservatives in the House, whether intentionally or unwittingly, are they essentially spouting Kremlin talking points with respect to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I'll maybe start at the end and say, I have not been one to accuse anybody of spouting Kremlin or any other talking points, right? So I opposed the Iraq war before we invaded. And people accuse me of being pro-Saddam because Saddam Hussein didn't want to get his country invaded and we were going to invade it, and therefore saying we shouldn't invade it was pro-Saddam. I felt like it was pro-America, and I feel even more strongly about that today. So I tend not to say, does the Kremlin want us to be involved in the war in Ukraine? No. So therefore, if you say we shouldn't be involved in the war in Ukraine, you're pro-Kremlin? I mean, in one sense, I guess, yes. But in the other sense, it might have been in Saddam's interest and in our interest not to have invaded Iraq. So I don't think anybody is getting, whatever the modern equivalent of Pravda is and sort of, marching off into the House of Representatives and taking these talking points. You talked a little bit about the libertarians. I mean, to me, the divide in Republican politics is generational. So a lot of people who hate libertarians agree with us on NATO or Europe, for example. So the younger populists, for example, if you look at somebody like J.D. Vance, is by no one's definition of a libertarian, but thinks that America's resources are limited. We're $34 trillion in debt. We run trillion and a half dollar deficits each year, and has a more anxious view of China than a lot of his confreres do, and says, look, if we're going to have, munitions and materiel going somewhere, maybe it should be Taiwan in the front of the line and Ukraine should be more of a European problem. So I think it's, if you look at, the sort of Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, the sort of what I would say the older generation of Republicans, they tend to be more unreconstructed hawks. And the younger people, the Ramaswamis, the Vances, these other folks tend to be much more, at least in the kind of prioritizer camp that says, because Russia is not in any position to be the European hegemon that we feared Wilhelmine and Nazi Germany would be, or the Soviet Union would be, it's primarily a European problem.
That's if you agree about that. I mean, so what do you see Russia as a threat to Europe and as a direct threat to the United States?
I certainly don't see it as a direct threat to the United States, except to the extent that we make it one. A Russia that is having a trouble defeating Ukraine cannot simultaneously be a threat to become a European hegemon. It's just, I can hold one of those views or the other view, but I can't hold both of them at the same time, because on paper, Russia should be able, it should have in February of 2022 gone through Ukraine like a hot knife through butter. And the fact that it did not suggests that were it to stretch these supply lines 400 or 500 more miles and go into Poland, to say nothing of, France or Germany. I mean, France has a nuclear deterrent. Germany, for all its warts, is an immense economy, and if mobilized. So I'm kind of old-fashioned in that sense, right? I worry about, again, one country literally dominating the continent. And it's okay to me for Europe to have normal international politics and even a war or two that doesn't involve the United States if it doesn't implicate U.S. security interests.
Well, speaking of Germany, Justin, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you've done a lot of work, I know, on this idea of burden sharing in NATO. The idea that other nations need to be spending more on their defense to take some of the load off the U.S. Former President Trump just outlined this again in his Time magazine interview this week, went into great depth about the idea of burden sharing in Europe. I'd like to come at this question sort of a different way here. And isn't there a reason from a historical point of view that the U.S. is, of course, the leader here? We don't need to rehash 80 years of post-World War II history, but the idea of Germany being a major military power that can maybe go toe-to-toe with Russia militarily is worrisome to some, or at least it used to be. But do you think the environment has changed and that we're so far gone from those days that it's time for just a total reimagining of security in Europe, and who pays for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the German problem is essentially stood on its head. The German problem historically was you have this country with a particularly outsized economic capacity that had recurring imperial ideas about its role in Europe. And we had two big, bloody, grotesque wars to show for it. And I think now, like, if I couldn't tell that story with a straight face now, right? The idea that Germany is going to, I mean, number one, France has nuclear weapons. Number two, Russia has nuclear weapons. Number three, I think Germany has been, over 4 generations, so transformed that now the problem is we need more German defense exertion. I mean, we're talking about spending 2% of GDP on defense, and we can get into the accounting weeds on the Zeitenwende and all the rest of it. But the world needs more Germany.
Let's talk about Iran and Iranian proxies then in the same context, right? I mean, is Iran, is Hezbollah, are the proxies like the Houthis in Yemen really a threat to the United States?
So I do think that in large part, the U.S. presence in the Middle East is part of this sort of circular problem where we have, someone attacks our forces in Iraq or Syria, and then we feel we have to retaliate. We retaliate, then we're trying to de-escalate from, and you say to yourself, what is the political end that these forces are supposed to be aimed at? And, the official story after the Tower 22 attack and all the rest of it was, well, of course, we're fighting ISIS, you see. And then if you look at ISIS, or you look at the Inspector General reports about what forces in Syria, for example, have been doing, in the last quarter report that I read from the Inspector General, there were no kinetic engagements with enemy forces from these guys. So ISIS is kind of, in military terms at least, not really a heavyweight at this point, to put it in the most mild terms I can imagine. So the idea that this, is even pale image of the caliphate that we saw in the early teens emerge is just delusional. And anybody, you get a couple beers in them at happy hour and they will admit to you, well, no, of course, the reason we're in Syria is to screw with Iran.
Quickly on ISIS before we wrap up here, Justin, the external attacks we've seen in the past few months in Iran, in Moscow, of course, has that changed your perception of ISIS-K specifically and where they're going as a threat?
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem of the global war on terror, which is that we are really good at military operations. And we, especially after 9/11, worried an awful lot about terrorism. So we thought that this, coercive tool that we have in conventional military will go deal with this terrorism problem. But terrorism is really difficult to get your arms around with conventional forces. And so with the caliphate, we had something completely different, right? We had terrorists, or people who I would call terrorists, running a kind of sort of government and extracting taxes and all the rest of it. But the problem for them is they quickly learned, which is that when you start behaving like a state, we get really good at destroying you. And they met their bitter end. So now that they've gone back to the more sort of typical terrorist operations, like shooting up a shopping mall, yes, we don't have a lot of tools to deal with that. We can do intelligence, we can do soft raids, we can do all sorts of different things. But, you're not going to sign a treaty on the decks of the Missouri with ISIS. So, you want to minimize the number of recruits. You want to do the political hard work, which is much less sexy than blowing stuff up. But at the end of the day, the tools that you have for making, bringing to a 0% certainty the chance that something like this could get through, you don't have a lot of good tools for that. And that's, the luxury of being a think tanker and not an elected official is you can just say that out loud.
Justin Logan, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week. This is a weekly segment where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the listeners, the American public right now. Guy, what's your threat of the week?
Ben, I'm going outside the United States as I normally do. My threat of the week is that the military nexus between North Korea and Russia is growing, especially with regard to the war in Ukraine. For context here, there's a lot of talk in U.S. national security circles about the axis of autocracies or the axis of tyrannies, or just the growing alignment between Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. But it's difficult to pinpoint the actual tissue or depths of relations between each of those countries across the dime, the so-called diplomatic, informational, military, and economic spheres. But recent days gave a window right into that tissue between North Korea and Russia, specifically on the military sphere. The U.S. has for months accused North Korea of transferring weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. And on April 29, a confidential UN monitoring report said debris from a missile that landed in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv back on January 2nd was from a North Korean Hwasong-11 series ballistic missile, according to Reuters, which had an exclusive on the confidential UN report. The missile was presumably fired by Russian forces, and the fact that Russian forces have it and are using it is itself a violation of the UN arms embargo on North Korea. So now that this military connectivity between North Korea and Russia is fully out in the open, my question is, where does it go from here? And my threat of the week is that this connectivity is growing.
Yeah, it's going to be, that's a major theme that we'll, of course, follow here on the Threat Status Podcast. My threat of the week is Chinese neurotoxins, the threat of a new kind of biological weapon here. This is something that our colleague and friend of the show, Bill Gertz, highlighted recently. I'll include a link to Bill's most recent story on this subject in the podcast description below. But in a nutshell, Bill writes, China's military is conducting research on sea-based neurotoxins, raising fears among U.S. officials and analysts that Beijing is secretly developing deadly biological weapons for use in conflict. The disclosure of work on marine toxins is the first time Beijing has been accused of conducting this type of strategic weapons research. Now, this might remind us all of things like the anthrax scare after 9/11. There have been other instances throughout history, this 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. Are we prepared for some sort of biological attack? There are some signs we might not be. There have been a lot of strides, of course, in recent years, especially after COVID-19, which brought into sharp focus just how significant biological or health-related incidents can be. But Guy, right now, China's neurotoxin research and biological attacks are a threat. because we've never really dealt with one on a large scale. And in that sense, this would be new territory for all of us, and no one's sure exactly how it would play out.
Totally interesting, Ben. What's amazing to me is that this stuff all gets publicized in State Department documents every year, and you got to kind of read between the lines and dig through them to find the new nuggets. And Bill Gertz definitely did that with this, but you've also summarized it here.
What we do here at the Threat Status Podcast, to delve through government documents and identify threats for all the listeners. You're right. There's plenty out there. Thank you all for listening again this week. It's been a great episode. Thank you to Justin Logan from the Cato Institute for being on the show. Please, everyone, go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.